All right, on this set of notes, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how the colonies, the British colonies in the New World began to grow and some of the problems and some of the things that they encountered along the way. Why did they begin to grow? In large part, they began to grow because of a philosophy known as mercantilism. Mercantilism basically is the philosophy, economic philosophy, that the country with the most gold wins. And the way you get the most gold is by exporting more than you import. In other words, you're selling more stuff to other countries than you're buying from them. When you sell stuff to other countries, they give you money. That's the general gist of a sales transaction. When you buy stuff from them, you give them money. So if you're taking more money from them than you're giving to them, you're ending up on the positive side of the spreadsheet with a positive balance, a good balance of trade, and you're gaining more wealth to your country. That's the basic philosophy of mercantilism. And colonies were supposed to help with that by providing raw materials so that the mother country, in this case England, didn't have to get those raw materials or pay another country for them. And that's why England spent so much time trying to develop their colonies and trying to colonize other areas. So in large part, our colonies grow because of that. Uh, Another reason why our colonies begin to grow is of a policy pursued by the British called salutary neglect, uh, where they basically neglected the colonies. They gave the colonies the ability to govern themselves. In large part, this happened because of what was called the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, where James the First is taken from the throne in England, and William and Mary are put on the throne. And so during this time where you have all this tumult in England, they really don't have the resources to watch over their colonies. And so as a result, they pretty much let the colonies take care of themselves. And this really is what enables the colonies to govern themselves for the first time. And they like it. The colonies, though, begin to develop in two very distinct ways. You have the one set of colonies, the southern colonies, which develop around an agricultural economic model, and they embrace things like slavery. Slavery, part of what's called triangle trade, where ships would start off in Europe with manufactured goods, go down to Africa, unload those manufactured goods, buy slaves. Then they would sail across the Atlantic on what was called the Middle Passage, and trade their slaves in the New World for raw materials, and then take the raw materials back to England in this case. And the whole process would begin again after those raw materials were turned into some type of manufactured product. Shortly thereafter, this leads to one of the very first slave rebellions. It's called the Stono Rebellion, where you start to see evidence of the weakness of slavery, where slavery is unacceptable in a society where equality is one of the more basic virtues that is embraced. And the Stono Rebellion is just certainly evidence of that. So really one of the very first evidences of slavery and the opposition in the Americas, in the colonies, to slavery. Most of the southern colonies, since they were agricultural, depended on what were called cash crops. A cash crop could be anything from cotton or tobacco or tea. It was a crop that you wouldn't necessarily consume. It wasn't used as a foodstuff, but it was grown really to sell for cash. And these were grown really on plantations, and this is really what drove the need for slavery in the early South. There was really no way to harvest the crops that they were growing for cash in any way other than by manual labor, and slaves filled that purpose. The northern colonies, on the other hand, develop very differently. The northern colonies develop an industrial capacity. They manufacture things. They, in fact, are actually more like what England was. And because of this industry that was developed up in the north, you get immigration coming to the northern colonies from all over Europe, people in search of jobs. A reaction to some of this early immigration early on was the Salem witch trials, really. In Salem, Massachusetts, and the folks who were put on trial were often folks who were new, who were indentured servants. In fact, one of the first to be accused was an indentured servant, a black woman who'd come from the Caribbean, and that's really kind of kicks the whole things off. And before long, there are people all over the countryside who are being accused of being witches and who are being convicted on little to no evidence uh, of any kind of actual wrongdoing. The Enlightenment, then, is another movement that really has a big influence, especially on the northern colonies, but the southern colonies certainly as well. The Enlightenment was a philosophy that believed in equality and liberty, and believed in a government that was supposed to be responsive to the people. In fact, a government that truly only derived its just power from the consent of the governed. Ideas such as this were proposed by philosophers such as John Locke. from England, who first said that man has certain inalienable rights. And Thomas Jefferson would take those thoughts and put them into our Declaration of Independence. Prominent Enlightenment philosophers or thinkers from our world, from the New World, included people like Ben Franklin, who was certainly one of the more significant of our founding fathers, who really had an impact on our desire to be independent, and he advocated for independence from Great Britain. Another movement that really kind of started to push the United States away from England is called the Great Awakening. It's a religious revival, a rebirth, a renewed interest in things religious. And some of the more prominent preachers from the Great Awakening included Jonathan Edwards, and probably even more significant than Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, who really advocated for an independence from Great Britain, for the Americas, for the United States, or the colonies at that point, to be unique, to be their own. But the thing that really starts to push the colonies away, both the North and the South, is the French and Indian War. The French had started to encroach upon what the English considered to be their colonies, and that's evidenced by their building of a fort out at the junction of three rivers in what today would be western Pennsylvania. It was called Fort Duquesne. And the colonists had been hearing rumors about this, and so they go ahead and they go to Great Britain that they would like to go ahead and investigate and see if this is true. So the British go ahead and pick a young colonial officer by the name of George Washington to lead a group out there, and sure enough, he gets out to the junction of these three rivers in what today would be Pittsburgh, actually. Three River Stadium was built there at this juncture, and he finds a French fort called Fort Duquesne. And out of necessity, George Washington then builds his own fort and creatively calls it Fort Necessity, and there is a skirmish out there. And this is really one of the first times where George Washington begins to develop a disdain, especially for the British military. A lot of the British soldiers turn and run, and he has to try to rally them against the French. And so this really forms some important impressions for the young George Washington. Other important figures in the French and Indian War, Edward Braddock, William Pitt, were both British officials. William Pitt, in fact, probably more than anybody else, he was the prime minister, so was Braddock. But William Pitt takes over for Braddock, and he decides that they're going to win this war. And William Pitt spends whatever money is necessary to defeat the French. He goes into heavy deficit spending, and he gets the English military up to speed and really enables them to win. And the general in charge of that is James Wolfe. He comes up with a theory that the French colonies are like a tree. And if you want to chop down a tree, you don't chop down the branches, you chop down the trunk. And he believed the trunk of the tree was Quebec. If you take Quebec, the city of Quebec, the rest of the French colonies will fall. So the English go right for the jugular. They march on the city of Quebec, and in fact, they do take the city, and the French colonies fall, and the French lose the French and Indian War. And this leads to the Proclamation of 1763. A lot of the Indians sided with the French because they were afraid that the English were going to keep moving westward. And the English knew that if the colonists moved westward, they did not have the means to go ahead and defend them. So the Proclamation of 1763 basically said, look, colonists should stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. The English saw this as a way to help protect their colonies and prevent them from incurring damage at the hands of the Native Americans. The colonists didn't see it that way. The colonists felt like this was an effort to control them, an effort for England to keep an eye on them. And so they rebelled against it. They felt like this was an abuse of what they thought to be their rights. The other reason the British did it is because they couldn't keep sending troops to defend the colonies. They were simply out of money. The war had almost bankrupted them. And so one of the things they did to help pay for the war was they passed what was called the Sugar Act. It was a tax on sugar in the colonies, and they felt like the colonists, who were doing quite well for themselves by this point, should help pay for this war that they just fought on the colonists' behalf, or at least that's the way the English saw it. And so they go ahead and pass the Sugar Act, incredibly unpopular amongst the colonists because it increases the cost of their sugar. And so this is, again, you begin to see some of the fractures between England and the colonies as a result of the French and Indian War.